Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Poonam Chawla, an assistant professor with Maharaja Agrasen Institute of Management Studies in Rohini. Today we are going to discuss on the interesting subject of transfer of training. Once you are through with this module, you will be able to understand the nitty-gritties involved in the transfer of training. Now let us start with the concept of transfer of training. Transfer of training means that learners are able to transfer their knowledge and skills learned in a training session once they return to their jobs. Organizations are spending billions of dollars each year on training, yet only a fraction of that investment results in improved performance if training transfer is not supported by the stakeholders. These stakeholders include the managers, the peers, the customers, and the employers. Stakeholders also assume responsibility for supporting transfer. Now, how to transfer learning into performance? The goal of training is not simply to gain knowledge and skills, but to transfer learning into performance, which in turn leads to improvement in organizational results. We need to understand that training transfer is a dynamic and complex process that requires proper planning. Transfer of training is based on the theory of transfer of learning. We can say, as Holding defines it, transfer of training occurs whenever the effects of previous learning influence the performance of a later activity. Types of transfer of training. There are three types of transfer of training. One is positive transfer, second is negative transfer, and the third is zero transfer. Let us discuss positive transfer first. Positive transfer is when prior learning or training facilitates acquiring a new skill or reaching the solution to a new problem. In such a situation, the individual performs better than he would have without the prior training. In positive transfer, previous learning facilitates performance in the transfer task. An example could be the knowledge and skills related to school mathematics help in the learning of statistical computation. Negative transfer. This is when prior learning or training hinders acquiring a new skill or reaching the solution to a new problem. In negative transfer, the opposite is the case. Previous learning interferes with the transfer task. Zero transfer. In this situation, past experience or training neither enhances nor hinders acquiring a new skill or reaching the solution of a new problem. Transfer can be understood as falling somewhere on four continuous dimensions. That is near versus far transfer, specific versus general transfer, surface versus deep transfer, and transfer can also be positive or negative transfer. Near versus far transfer. Near transfer occurs when the training context and trained behavior are almost identical to the application context and application behavior. For example, a student learns an arithmetic rule with problems on a worksheet and then applies the same rule in the same way on the same day to similar problems in a mathematics workshop. Far transfer. The two situations are interestingly different. For example, the student who has learned a basic arithmetic rule proceeds to apply it later in a variety of word problems with no cues. Specific versus general transfer. Specific transfer occurs when the contents of the learning are transferred. For example, a student who is taught the basic organizational components, narrative uses exactly those components later in writing an organized and elaborated story. The general transfer. In the case of general transfer, general skills or underlying principles are transferred. For example, the same student may recognize that there is an organized structure that needs to be imposed on other types of writing as well and not just stories. Maintenance over time. Maintenance of a behavior or skill is a type of transfer. In this case, the learned skill or behavior is maintained from one time to another. In transfer experiments, maintenance is often tested 1 or more months after the original learning. Let us discuss surface versus deep transfer. Surface transfer. The student transfers learning to a similar set of circumstances. For example, having learned about the items present on a car dashboard, the student driver applies the learning to a different looking dashboard. Deep transfer. In deep transfer, the student might transfer that learning to an airplane dashboard that looks very different. Transfer of training process. Now let us discuss the transfer of training process. Transfer of training process refers to trainees effectively and continuously applying what they learned in training, knowledge, skills, behaviors, cognitive strategies to their jobs. The work environment plays a vital role in ensuring the transfer of training occurs. Transfer of training is also influenced by trainee characteristics and training design. A model of the transfer process is shown in this diagram for better understanding. As the model shows, transfer of training includes both the generalization of training to the job and the maintenance of the learned material. Now let us discuss the concept of generalization. Generalization refers to a trainee's ability to apply learned capabilities, the verbal knowledge, motor skills, etc., to on-the-job work problems and situations that are similar but not identical to those problems and situations encountered in the learning environment. Maintenance. Maintenance refers to the process of continuing to use newly acquired capabilities over time. For generalization and maintenance to occur, capabilities must be learned and retained. The model shows 3 factors influence learning and transfer of training. The 3 basic factors that influence learning and transfer of training, as you can see in the diagram, are training design, trainee characteristics, and work environment. Training design. Training design refers to the characteristics of the learning environment. Training design incorporates important features of the learning environment, which includes meaningful material, opportunities to practice, feedback, learning objectives, and program organization, and also incorporates physical features of the training site. Another factor that influences learning and retention is trainee characteristics. Trainee characteristics include ability and motivation that affects learning. If trainees lack the basic skills needed to master learned capabilities like cognitive ability, reading skills, and are not motivated to learn and do not believe that they can master the learned capabilities, it is doubtful that learning and transfer of training will occur. Work environment. The third factor that influences learning, retention, and transfer is the work environment. The work environment includes factors on the job that influence transfer of training such as manager support, peer support, technology support, climate for transfer, and the opportunity to use newly acquired capabilities on the job. The main factors that influence transfer of training are massed versus spaced practice, whole versus part learning, overlearning, maximize similarity, vary the situation, knowledge of results, combination of relapse prevention and goal setting. Massed versus spaced practice. Research has shown that material learnt via the spaced practice is generally retained longer than material under the method of massed practice. It has been seen that spaced practice requires longer training cycles and the management of organizations tend to avoid it. This approach gives trainee time to think about their knowledge, skills and abilities and even practice their own knowledge, skills and abilities for further improvement. Complex and difficult tasks have been seen to be effective and performed better when massed practice is provided first. Now let us discuss whole versus part learning. It is difficult to design part task training in many cases. Whole training programs are easier to design because the design can be a model of a real device. Even when the task in the training program can be divided into different parts, the whole learning method is preferred when the intelligence levels are high in the trainees. Task organization refers to the extent or degree to which different tasks in a training program can be interrelated. In designing any training program, it is not practical to attempt to subdivide the task into different parts. Even if it is possible to subdivide them into different parts, the whole learning methodology still needs to be used if the task or organization is very high. If you see that the task organization is very low, the part learning method could be used. Another option here could be progressive part training, which can be used when tasks are not clear in the organization, wherein both whole and part learning methods need to be used. This way, the trainee learns each step but at the same time learns the integration of all the steps also. Overlearning. Let us talk about overlearning. This is the process of providing trainees with continuous practice far beyond the point at which they perform the task effectively. This is very similar to automaticity. The more the task is overlearned, the better is its retention. Overlearning is valuable for tasks that are not performed frequently or if the chance to practice them is very limited. Even when the material is overlearned, it is essential to put mechanisms in place to reinforce the use and practice of the learned behavior on a continual basis, especially when it is a recently developed knowledge, skill and aptitude. When trainees practice a skill beyond the ability to perform a task, the responses become more automatic and eventually do not require thinking. For this to happen, overlearning is extremely important for tasks in high intensity emergency situations. Overlearning also occurs after a great amount of on-the-job practice, which is automaticity. Automaticity is a level where performance is fluid and requires very little conscious effort and is automatic. Automaticity through the process of overlearning should be designed in training programs where the tasks to be performed are in highly stressful situations or those tasks that are not encouraged frequently in one's job and hence should be performed effectively whenever it occurs. Maximize similarity. This is also known as identical elements. The more the elements in the training program are similar to the actual work settings, the more likely it is that a positive transfer of training will occur. The two areas of similarity are the tasks to be performed and the environment in which they are to be performed. After a basic skill is learned, it is necessary for trainees to practice the skill in a similar environment to their actual workplace environment so that they can ensure proper transfer of training. Vary the situation. When conceptual or administrative skills training is required, a good deal of variability often characterizes typical situations and the use of identical elements is not effective. The general principle approach is more useful in this case. Knowledge of results. It is necessary to provide feedback to the trainees, and it is important also on the transfer of training to the job. It allows them to correct their responses and make necessary adjustments in their behavior. It makes learning more interesting and it encourages them. Inexperienced trainee may try to be supportive. Research indicates that a trainee can master a task when feedback indicates it, and it also improves his or her self-efficacy. And individuals with high self-efficacy tend to be highly motivated and also tend to achieve more. Combination of relapse prevention and goal setting. A major reason for the transfer of training not occurring is that the trainees face the same pressures when they are back on the job, which had earlier reduced their performance effectiveness. One of the strategies used, called relapse prevention, sensitizes the trainees to the fact that their pressures that reduced effectiveness could relapse and help them prepare to identify the situations which will result in preventing the relapse and help them develop strategies to cope to prevent the relapses. Goal setting also increases the likelihood of transfer of training. Research has shown that relapse prevention is not always successful without goal setting. The contribution of both relapse prevention and goal setting is a powerful technique to initiate transfer of training. Let us look at the summary of the module. The use of effective training principles can help maximize the effectiveness of training initiatives, many of which are influenced by critical forces such as interdependence among agencies, employee development, talent retention, new technology, skill gaps, and alignment of individual training to agency-specific priorities. It is vital to design and implement effective training programs to help address these forces and further agency objectives. It is also important to recognize and overcome the many factors that can inhibit the transfer of training, like lack of accountability, inadequate resources, and few opportunities to use training knowledge. Thank you. I hope you understood the module well.